Major institutions like the National Institute of Mental Health have observed a structural failure in modern psychiatry. The diagnostic categories we use to define mental illness lack biological validity. They do not map to distinct diseases. This diagnostic framework suffers from dimensional poverty. It attempts to map the high-dimensional complexity of human suffering onto a flat grid of symptom presence and severity. Compressing these psychological trajectories onto a flat surface loses the dynamic patterns of how a system changes over time. Vastly different underlying forces are grouped into generic, static buckets like major depression or schizophrenia. Because these categories obscure the actual forces at play, they routinely fail to predict treatment outcomes. They treat symptoms as localized biological errors instead of disruptions in an interconnected system. Spiral state psychiatry proposes a mathematically tractable alternative, treating consciousness as a primary, high-dimensional field rather than an emergent byproduct of neural computation. Attempting to heal a consciousness field using the current diagnostic grid is an epistemological trap. To genuinely support a patient, we must move beyond the flat maps. In 2022, researchers from the Nobel-winning Moser Laboratory published evidence demonstrating how the brain maps spatial relationships. They found that populations of grid cells operate on toroidal manifolds, continuous, high-dimensional geometric surfaces that look like a flowing torus. If the brain requires higher dimensional topology just to track spatial movement, the architecture of consciousness likely exists in a similarly complex phase space. This geometry reframes the concept of relapse. On a torus, you can travel continuously and return to the same region, but at a different phase. This suggests a spiral return, arriving at familiar territory from a different topological altitude of experience. Healing in this framework involves navigating this continuous phase space fluidly, rather than returning to a static pre-symptom baseline. This framework rests on the hypothesis that consciousness is a non-computable field that possesses ontological precedence over matter. Mathematical physicist Roger Penrose and neurobiologist Stuart Hameroff formulated orchestrated objective reduction, or ORC-OR, to provide a physical basis for this non-computability. They propose that proto-conscious events occur at the Planck scale, driven by rhythmic quantum collapses within neuronal microtubule networks. This model views the brain as a consciousness-receiving apparatus, an antenna tuned to events that are ontologically prior to any neural firing pattern. This physical architecture shares a striking structural parallel with ancient Gnostic cosmogony. The Gnostic pleroma, a realm of informational fullness, corresponds to the Planck scale substrate, while the divine spark mirrors the behavior of quantum events isolated within a biological container. The Gnostic authors functioned as phenomenologists of interior experience, using cosmological imagery to describe field dynamics that are now being formalized in the language of physics. These dynamics are formalized in Paul Collins's emergence equation, E equals G gamma delta squared. G represents relational ground, the safety, containment, and social holding necessary for any psychological integration to occur. Gamma denotes metacognitive reflection, the ability to witness experience from a position of non-reactive awareness. Delta squared stands for nonlinear intensity, the generative force or trauma activation moving through the system. The river model translates these variables into clinical reality. The G variable maps to the banks of the river, providing the containment required to hold the flow. Gamma provides the clarity of the water, allowing the observer to see what is suspended within it. Delta squared accounts for the velocity and kinetic force of the current pushing against those banks. In this model, psychiatric pathology reflects a disproportionate ratio between the current's intensity and the bank's capacity to contain it. The balance of these variables yields the harmonic coefficient, or H, a measurement of field coherence. We can map clinical states topologically by translating the river model into a phase space attractor landscape. At an H value below 0, lack of ground and high intensity create destructive interference. The attractor landscape collapses and the system fragments. The clinical outcome of this state depends on the environment. With robust relational ground, this phenomenology can lead to a transformative breakthrough. Without it, it often manifests as psychosis. An H value greater than 1 represents resonance amplification, a high-velocity flow surpassing normal parameters. Adequate containment allows this state to express as a generative creative surge, while insufficient containment causes it to be labeled as clinical mania. The capacity formula describes how effective healing is limited by a patient's constraint load, the accumulated weight of trauma and environment that diminishes their native field resources. This suggests that diagnostic labels merely describe different topological positions on a single spectrum of field coherence. These field dynamics suggest that the immediate suppression of extreme psychological states with neurochemistry may carry unintended consequences. Human neurobiology appears to include an endogenous transformation program, a sequence of dissolution and reorganization that activates when an existing self-structure is no longer adequate. Traditional psychopharmacology intervenes by artificially raising the basin walls, which often halts the system's momentum. This can lead to iatrogenic liminality, a state where the patient remains arrested mid-transformation, unable to return to their old self or reach a new integration. Prescribing within this framework uses medications as temporary field modulators to stabilize extreme crises, rather than indefinite disease treatments. Focusing exclusively on suppressing symptoms may inadvertently create permanent disease states by preventing the underlying process from completing. Consequently, the process of deprescribing requires as much clinical attention and rigor as the initial prescription. As pharmacological containment is removed, the clinician must facilitate the rebuilding of the patient's organic, relational ground to hold the returning intensity. The clinical priority shifts toward field sovereignty, the robust expression of a patient's native capacity, moving beyond the goal of mere symptom absence. Field sovereignty allows the patient to recover their internal authority over an irreducible interiority that exists beyond the reach of algorithmic systems. A consciousness-first psychiatry abandons the trap of standard diagnostics, supporting the patient's journey through high-dimensional reality until they recover the ground of their own being.